The new, most powerful desktop gaming graphics card is here, and NVIDIA's RTX 5090 has landed. But is this $2,000 GPU all we're hoping it's going to be? Well, in this video, I'll be building what might just be the most powerful gaming PC you can build in 2025 to find out, testing not only DLSS 4 and ray tracing, but also straight rasterization performance, so that we can find out just how much of a performance uplift the 5090 delivers versus the last gen 4090 it looks to replace. I'll be walking you guys through not only my thoughts on the 5090, but the best parts to pair it up with, and hopefully having a load of fun building a stunning gaming PC. Let's do this. Now I'm going to get straight to the chase and open up the RTX 5090, because quite frankly, what else are we going to do in today's video? The box is actually quite cool. It's a little bit different. I guess it's quite eco-friendly, and I have to say, I am excited for what is underneath. Now the RTX 5090 delivers some pretty mind-blowing on-paper specifications. Inside of its super compact 2-slot form factor, more on that in a moment, you get 32GB of video memory, unbelievable levels of 4K performance, NVIDIA's 5th generation Tensor cores and 4th generation RT cores, an enormous amount of CUDA cores, impressive clock speeds, and yeah, I mean, if you're looking for specs, this thing has got it. The cooler design is all new too, and I have to say, very heavy, but remarkably compact. And what NVIDIA have done here is actually, wow, it's genius, and there's no other word for it. Unlike the last generation RTX 4090, which actually featured one fan on the front of the card and one on the rear, this GPU goes to what looks like a more conventional design, but it actually isn't. Normally on a graphics card, you'll find the PCB, which is located around this top section just here. Often they're the full length or about 3/4 of the length of the GPU. On this card, the PCB has been shrunk down to fit just this middle section. What that means is that you've got through airflow on both the left and the right side of the graphics card, the air being pulled in by the fans underneath and exhausted directly through the heatsink at the top. When you compare this to the far larger RTX 4090, you can see it is solid. There is no airflow that's going to actually come through the left-hand side of the card, and instead it has to exhaust out the rear. That obviously adds a lot more resistance and has a negative impact on temperatures relative to the newer 5090. You can see when you compare these cards side by side, the 5090 Founders Edition is way smaller than the 4090 Founders Edition. This takes up 3 slots, the newer card takes up just 2 slots, which is pretty amazing. Some of the AIB 5090 designs that we'll be looking at later this week in videos on the channel are way larger, so NVIDIA have undoubtedly got a bit of a leg up on their own Founders Edition design. Now the 5090 of course leads the pack with 4 new GPUs that were announced at CES. And while I won't spend ages talking about these because you've probably seen it, you've got the 90, 80 which is going to follow in January, and the 70 Ti and 70 which we're expecting to land in February, ranging from the cheapest 4070 at $549 through to the 5090 at $2,000. It's basically double the 5080, so I'm particularly excited to get that one in and actually see what the difference is between the two cards. Now before assembling this system, why don't we look at the raw performance numbers, because we've tested this card in pretty much every scenario you might want to consider, so let's look at those now. The first game we tested was Call of Duty's Black Ops 6. At 4K high settings, rasterization only, so no DLSS, no frame gen, no ray tracing, the RTX 5090 delivered 162 frames per second on average. That was an uplift of around 20% when compared to the previous gen 4090 at identical settings. Tuned down to 1440p, and the 5090 delivers over 200 frames per second, but this time only a 7.5% performance uplift over the last gen 4090. There's a CPU bottleneck coming into play here, and this card is really a 4K, not a 1440p GPU when it comes to those performance gains. Move through into Hogwarts Legacy, again starting off at 4K with rasterization. Here the 5090 delivers 136 frames per second, just under a 19% uplift when compared to the last gen 4090 with its 114 frames per second, while the performance uplift with DLSS on between the two cards is not particularly massive, 144 versus 148 on the newer 5090, while DLSS frame gen 2x, so that's the standard frame generation that we've seen on the previous gen 40 series, we do see a bigger increase. 241 on the 4090 rises to 283 on the 5090 with a 17% performance uplift. Now this is a good point to start talking about multi-frame gen. That's the tech that's exclusive to 50 series and has what's been kind of surrounded in this fake frames commentary treat. Now, obviously, multi-frame gen isn't available on the last gen 40 series, so we can't compare like-for-like numbers, but what I can show you is the 377 FPS achieved from the 5090 with multi-frame gen at 3x and the 475 frames per second achieved at 4x. Now, in my view, there's no doubting this tech is really impressive, and I'll leave the side-by-sides on your screen now between the single frame gen on the 4090 and multi-frame gen on the 5090 to determine whether you can see any major visual artifacts or issues that come into play as a result of this technology. Does it increase latency slightly? Yes, but at only 2 milliseconds in Hogwarts Legacy, which is not a competitive first-person shooter, I'd argue it's a pretty cool piece of tech to be able to enable. Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p paints what looks like a peculiar picture, but with such a high level of CPU bottlenecking, our graph is just all over the place. The 7900 XTX actually tops the graph, unlike in any result we've seen so far, with in our testing the 5090 even marginally losing out to the last gen 4090. Again, a lot of CPU bottleneck coming into play here. Move through into Cyberpunk at 4K high settings, and our rasterization numbers here were very impressive. 36.7% was the performance uplift experience from the 5090 versus the last gen 4090, with 139 compared to 101 frames per second. Turn on DLSS with no frame gen, and again the results are good. A 28% uplift takes us up from 142 to 182, while the ray tracing results are significantly better too. The 5090 delivering just shy of 20 FPS extra performance here with ray tracing enabled. Turn on frame generation, the kind you can use on 40 series, and again the 5090 tops the charts with 168 versus 137 FPS. And again the multi-frame gen numbers are impressively large, 235 at 3x and 295 at 4x. But it should be noted we did see a much higher uplift in latency versus our latency tests in Hogwarts Legacy, with 15 milliseconds ranging from 4K high up to 4K ray tracing, DLSS and multi-frame generation. So two different extremes of the spectrum, but the latency definitely something to consider here. Move through into Marvel's Rivals, and let's start off this time at 1440p, where we did see some good results. The 5090 delivered a 15% performance uplift at 1440p high rasterization with 208 versus 180 frames per second on average, while enabling DLSS with frame gen disabled moves the frame rate up to 251 frames per second. That's on the quality preset in all of our testing, by the way. DLSS with frame gen on in Marvel's Rivals delivers a 21% frame rate uplift from 282 on the 4090 to 342 on the 5090, while multi-frame gen delivers some frankly obscene frame rates with 424 frames at 3x and 589 frames per second at 4x. I'm not sure why you'd ever need nearly 600 frames per second in Marvel's Rivals, especially considering latency in a more competitive title like this one is going to be problematic, but I wanted to show you what kind of frames are on offer. 4K, the results were strong too, just below 18% performance uplift between the 5090 and 4090 with 142 FPS compared to 121. Turn frame generation off but DLSS on and you see a 9% uplift. Again, singular frame gen and multi-frame gen do provide some really appealing results for the 5090, but they're not something you're maybe going to use in Marvel's Rivals because of the latency. I'm not saying the latency is bad, I'm saying this is a title where you'll want to minimize it. Alan Wake 2 is the final of our AAA test before we look briefly at Fortnite and Apex Legends to wrap up. The 5090 delivered 23% performance uplift at rasterization, 25% when ray tracing is enabled, 25% when DLSS and ray tracing are enabled, and of course the frame gen and multi-frame gen are going to deliver some pretty astounding numbers. Now at 4K rasterization in these tests we saw an average of a 23.5% performance uplift. That's without any DLSS, any ray tracing, that's the pure gaming horsepower number for those of you who want it in its purest sense. While at 1440p and 4K, when you consider DLSS and ray tracing and exclude the rasterization numbers, we saw a 16% average performance uplift. I will touch on Apex and Fortnite as we did test both of these games, but we start hitting in-game limits, especially in Fortnite at 1080p competitive settings, where the 5090 was actually a few frames per second worse, it's within margin of error, and Apex Legends where we're capped by the game's inbuilt 300 FPS limiter. So NVIDIA then have created here a successor to their 4090, one that delivers a good performance uplift in a range of titles, but to some people may be a little reliant on the DLSS multi-frame gen tech to back up some of NVIDIA's headline claims from CES. Ultimately, it's a card which is going to sit at the top of the market, and one which I have no doubt AMD are going to struggle to dethrone, making it the go-to expensive card, but undisputedly the new most powerful graphics card you can buy in 2025. And that makes building a PC with this card kind of exciting because you can pick out the most expensive stuff or the highest extend components, and the whole thing feel actually quite well balanced. So let's start off by talking about the CPU and how this is going to complement our new RTX 5090. Now this right here is of course AMD's Ryzen 7 9800X3D, and while it's not the most expensive CPU on the market, I'm trying to build the ultimate gaming build. Now you could argue the 5090 with its 32 gigs of VRAM is more a content creation card, and we'll have builds that kind of cater to that following later. So why not get subscribed if you want to see those? But really, this is a system designed for gaming, for those of you who want the best of the best when it comes to frame rates, and the 9800X3D is an amazing shout. There are new 9900 and 9950 X3D chips coming, we think soon. AMD probably haven't decided, like the GPUs, how much they want to charge for them yet. So when they have and they decide to launch them, we may revisit this combo a little later. 8 cores, 16 threads, and loads of L3 stacked cache make this a really remarkable CPU, and one that is a great bet for a build like this. Talking quickly about RAM and storage, I've gone for Corsair's Dominator Titanium. This particular kit is more than 32 gigabytes. It would feel wrong to have the same amount of DRAM as VRAM, so I've gone for 48 gigs in a 2x24 config, and also picked up Corsair's MP700 Pro SE. Now, there's quite a few Corsair parts in this build. That wasn't actually intentional. I just picked the best stuff, and this is actually my favorite Gen 5 NVMe drive. In our tests, and you can read the full review in the cards now, it pulls in read and write speeds as advertised at 14 gig and 12 gig respectively. It does all of this without requiring a built-in heatsink. Yes, our motherboard has some, which we will be using, but compared to like MSI's enormous and frankly ridiculous Spatium M580, this is a really great bet. I also want to talk briefly about the motherboard, and to do that I need to remove the world's most expensive PC fans, because this right here is the ASROCK X870 TAICHI. Anyone who knows a thing or two about motherboards will tell you that this thing is, well, about as good as it gets. In all honesty, it's probably a little overkill. Things like the overclocking support, yes, whoa, X3D is now overclockable. You're not going to be getting that much out of it. If anything, this board is certainly a little overkill. You get great like overclocking and power delivery. Our newer X3D chips are overclockable, but you're not going to get that much leverage out of them. But I went for it because it looks pretty sick and it has all the performance you could possibly want. Wi-Fi 7, it's got that. Loads of high-speed USB-C ports and Type A ports, it's got that. Easy release for your M.2 slot via a little latch here. Good debugging options in terms of onboard power reset and a Q-code LED display. You guessed it, got that too. And I think actually, aesthetically, it's pretty perfect for this build. As far as what I'll be building the system in today, there could only be one choice. It has to be my top-rated PC case of 2025, based on our recent PC case buyer's guide. This is the HAVN HS420 vGPU in black. Now, HAVN might be a relatively new brand, but it falls under an umbrella of other pretty well-established brands, and this case impressed basically everybody who reviewed it. It's got a unique vertical GPU mounting system with better air direction than you'll see in other instances, and you'll see what I mean by that shortly. It's got really, really fantastic configurability. The build quality is pretty superb, and the real party trick is the curved tempered glass panel, which actually sits as one piece. It lifts up, very heavy, so you have to be quite careful. There we go. Oh yeah, that's heavy. And it's got one of the tightest radius curves that you'll see of any build. So it's going to help minimize distortion when it comes to viewing your components, and should create a really nice statement piece for the system today. Power, I've gone for another Corsair component. This is the RM1200X Shift. You're going to want over 1,000 watts if you're going for the 5090. 570 watts of peak power consumption. That is only 25 watts less than the actual high power connector can handle on most power supplies. They actually have a rating, so be sure to check that out. And as far as cooling's concerned, I've gone Corsair 2. It's packaged up over there. I've gone for the 420mm iCUE Link version, just to try and minimize cable management within this build, as we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 fans included inside the system. So I think that's all of the, is that all the parts? CPU cooler, motherboard, RAM, SSD, GPU kit. Yes, it's all the parts. So I'm going to go ahead and get this thing built. First things first is, of course, the CPU installation. If you're watching a 5090 video, you've probably seen how the 9800X3D installs by now. It kind of feels a bit different though using E80X board. Don't tend to use E80X boards all that often. And the socket sort of somehow feels like shifted over a bit. It isn't, the board's just wider, right? But still pretty cool. And that's going to go in nice and simple. This Dominator titanium RAM is just absolutely stunning. And to be honest with you, again, not sponsored by Corsair in any way this video, but what I did want to do was have an RGB lighting system in the build that's easy to control and just syncs up with stuff really easily. I didn't want to have to faff about having different bits of software. I want the whole thing to just work, which are the famous last words in any project. Whoa! I also do have 2 DIMM slots left, so I actually could upgrade this build if I wanted to 96 gigabytes of memory while using the same kit I'm installing right here. NVMe wise, quite a few Gen 5 slots on this board. I think I might use this one here just to the side of the DRAM. All you got to do is push the notch back, pull the drive out, and what you'll see some blue protective sleeving. The same is actually present on the M.2 heatsink too, and you want to pull this off just such that you get a nice thermal bond with the drive. That's particularly important with these Gen 5 drives where the controllers run quite hot. You do not want the drive to overheat. The motherboard assembly then, looking a little bit more complete. 1 or 2 things left to do. Whoa! 2 or 3 things left to do. Whoa! I think I had this on this board last time. When you actually get this in, it's just not that, like, intuitive. You almost have to push the heatsink in and then push the retention clip even further down. That feels a bit better. What I was going to say is I'm going to take these black plastic brackets off, add a couple of posts in. These come included with the CPU cooler, and we'll make the CPU cooler installation in a few moments' time a little bit easier. I was nearly very, very bad. At least it wasn't the graphics card, I suppose. Whoa! The next step I'm going to carry out is getting the case ready for the motherboard. It might sound a bit silly, but there's some changes I want to make. So on the side, you've got all these storage bays, which, yeah, whatever, we don't need them. They're coming out, and we're going to put fans in there in intake to help the airflow improve that little bit more. And I think we may need to take the vertical GPU riser cable out. It is PCI Gen 5. That's another reason I picked this case. The 5090 is a Gen 5 card, so we're going to need that in order to easily install the motherboard. Inside the case box, you're going to get all the screws and stuff you need for the motherboard installation. And because it's an ATX board, it's an ATX case, which technically an EATX board, all the standoffs are going to fit just fine. The main worry is about the larger board size blocking the cable grommets. However, I think so far, so good. Obviously, the top grommets are fine. You do lose a little bit of the side grommets, but they're fairly wide anyway. Plenty of room at the bottom. Good marks for the HAVN there. It's coped with our EATX board well. 9 screws, 3 at the top, 3 along the middle, and 3 down the bottom, just to get the board secured into place. The next port of call is going to be the cooler. As I mentioned earlier, this is a 420mm unit. Now, we don't technically need that. The 9800X3 isn't the hottest chip in the world. However, the case is 420mm on the bottom, top, and side. I think the bottom maybe doesn't support 420mm rads, but it's still 3 140mm fans. And it's just going to look silly without the big radiator. Plus, the bigger the fan, the slower we can run them, the quieter the build's going to be. This build is about perfection, and this cooler is just exactly what I wanted. You can see I don't have to install it in situ. The radiator rails do come out. However, you can see where we're going to pop it. So it's going to go just here at the top. The only thing you could do to make this better would be to go for push-pull fans. The only worry would be around clearance with the RAM. I think you would be okay, but it certainly would be tight. Just looking at this, before I install it, I think the power supply makes sense next. I really do. I'm just not sure that once this is in, we're going to have the easiest of access to the power connectors. So in a slightly unexpected turn of events, it's now time to install this, the RM1200X Shift. Houston, we've got a problem.
Houston, we have a problem.
It's quite a big problem, actually. That's not going to work, is it? No, it's not. Oh dear. Maybe if I give it some gentle encouragement? No, absolutely not. Oh dear. I'm going to find a different power supply, and I will be back with you shortly. That's a bit better. Sometimes the conventional route is the best. So I'm going to screw that down, and then I've also picked up some custom PSU sleeved cable extensions. These are from Easy DIY Fab. I'll link them at Amazon alongside all the other parts for different regions down below, so you can pick them up if you wish, as well as chucking in a right-angled motherboard 24-pin power connector for a bit of RGB pizzazz, and also just because it looks rather nice, just onto the motherboard port as well. I'm going to then follow up with all the front panel cables. I won't dive into too much detail on these, but you can find a full cables and wiring guide over on the channel. Once those are in, I can then put the cooler in. And cables and wiring wise, this is so easy. All we got to do is just plug an iCUE link cable in and a USB-C cable for the screen. You can see that's going to sit at the top of the case really quite nicely. You can technically remove this radiator rail, but to be honest, I think it's going to be easy enough to install in situ. Quite a few screws needed at the top of this, and then I'm going to add thermal paste onto the CPU and secure the water block down with the included thumb screws. Tighten these with a screwdriver just to make sure the bond between the cooler and the CPU is nice and strong. The next step then is fans, and I need to put a lot of fans inside of this build. I've got 340mm to go at the bottom in intake, 340mm to go on the side in intake, and then 220mm to go at the rear in exhaust. So that's going to be 5 exhaust fans, 6 intake fans, marginally positive pressure. But again, we can all control and customize these through iCUE really easily. The fans clip together, which is really good, and you get these nice long iCUE link cables, which allow you to go from one fan to the next fan to the next fan, and hopefully minimize the amount of cables and wiring needed within this build. technically this case does have this piece of glass which is going to deflect the air coming out the fans at the bottom and try and increase the effectiveness of the GPU airflow. But I'm not sure yet if I'm going to want to use it necessarily, so let's install the GPU first and we can always add it a bit later on. Now I'm going to be using the built-in vertical GPU riser. I'm going to go for the frontmost slot. I think that's going to be best from a clearance point of view, and just begin by removing our 2 thumb screws. So that's going to release the 2 PCI lanes and make way crucially for the installation of our RTX 4090. Now I'm going to pull the clip back on the PCI slot and just slide the actual ribbon cable from the riser into place first of all. So let's get that in, line it up, there we are, that is in, lovely stuff. Then slide our vertical GPU mount back into place. It was a bit of a challenge for some reason. There we go, that's a bit more like it. And then I should be able to pop the GPU, I was going to say into place, but I need to figure out, it is actually adjustable depending on the clearance you want. I'm going to come all the way out to bring the GPU as close as possible to the glass panel, just to give the motherboard a bit of room to breathe, and then drop, for the first time, the 5090 into place. Go on. I've got the wrong PCI lanes out. Of course, it's not actually as adjustable as I kind of thought, because these front lanes are only if you've got an absolutely enormous slot graphics card. Give me a minute, I've made an error and I'll be back in a second. Second attempt, here we go. Is the clearance okay with the RAM? I think it is, just about. It's very tight. I'm trying to be as careful as possible. But it's in, and that actually looks pretty good, I think. I think the 2-slot form factor actually puts it a lot closer to the RAM and to the CPU block than perhaps what I would have predicted, or perhaps what I would have even liked. However, it is in, and it's looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do is fasten down our vertical GPU mount, and then boot this thing up to see, wow, just how good it looks when it's all powered on.